Good evening. My name is Katie Kennedy. I'm a member of a local organization called Delta Kappa Gamma, and our organization is hosting, introducing the lecture each week at the Discover Alaska this year. So on behalf of UAF Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning, welcome to those of you here in the room and also watching via live stream. Welcome to Discover Alaska. Before we begin the event this evening, I would like to mention that at UAF we acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations, upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. And here in Fairbanks, our Trouthy campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Dene people of the Lower Tanana River. This year's Discover Alaska lectures are all being presented by the UAF Institute of Arctic Biology, faculty members from IAB. And tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Andrea Bersamin.
Yes.
Great. Dr. Bersamin is a professor of nutrition. She joined the Center for Alaska Native Health Research and the Institute of Arctic Biology at UAF in 2008. Dr. Bersamin completed her PhD in nutritional science at the University of California, Davis, and a postdoc fellowship in cardiovascular disease epidemiology and prevention at Stanford University. Her research uses a participatory approach to address issues at the intersection of nutrition, food security and sovereignty, and health equity in partnership with Alaska Native people. So please help me welcome Dr. Andrea Bersamin.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Summer Sessions for hosting these public talks for our community and for hosting the Institute of Arctic Biology for the summer's Discover Alaska series. I'm really happy to be part of it. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. It's such a gorgeous evening, and it's the first one we've had in a few weeks, so I really appreciate you being here today. All right, so I'm going to be talking about food, nutrition, and health in Alaska, broadly speaking. What I'm going to be focusing on is how a traditional subsistence way of life can and should be strengthened to address many of the nutrition issues experienced in Alaska Native communities. And this is something that has been known and talked a lot by elders for a long time. I'll say that there's a lot of outstanding work being done in the state around traditional ways of living and health from a range of perspectives and disciplines. I'm a, let's see, I'll try this one.
Just click with your mouse and then your keyboard.
With a mouse. Nope. Any other suggestions? And while I'm getting IT support, I'll say that I'd like to create an informal environment, so please feel free to ask questions in the middle of the presentation. All right. Thank you. So I'm a public health nutrition scientist, which means that the research that I do around subsistence has implications for food and nutrition security, food sovereignty, and public health. And I want to say two things about public health. The first is that the concept of health within indigenous communities embodies wellness and balance, and is more than just the absence of disease, which is often how the field of public health frames it. The second thing I want to say about public health is really a plug for public health. There's an often cited statistic that since the 1900s, our life expectancy in the US has increased by 30 years. 5 years of that gain is attributed to medical interventions or advancements in medical interventions, and 25 years of that gain is due to public health efforts. And so that includes things like access to clean water and sanitation, access to safe and nutritious foods, regulations and policies around safe working places, and vaccinations. And those things, those public health efforts collectively do a lot towards keeping our population healthy. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge my funders and thank the collaborators whose work I'm presenting today. And in particular, I want to thank this really wonderful group of folks in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, elders, community members, and research staff from the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation who work really tirelessly to improve the health of their community. The research that I do follows what's called a community-based participatory approach. And since I started working in the Delta more than 15 years ago now, the research questions that I ask and the research that I do is being increasingly driven and co-led by some of the people pictured here. And we think about these kinds of questions like, how do we effectively center nutrition research around cultural strengths and traditional knowledge, especially that when the research enterprise that we work in can be a little bit linear and conceptions of health can be very different. How do we make sure that the work we do leads towards health equity and food sovereignty, and doesn't inadvertently perpetuate colonization? And then finally, a little bit more personally to me, what is the role of non-Indigenous researchers? So the elders who guide our work gave our collaboration or our work group the name Nekpiatput and Rugut, which means our food is medicine in Yupik. And it's intended to signify that a traditional subsistence way of life nourishes the mind, the body, the spirit, and the heart. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how a traditional subsistence way of life contributes to holistic health. What are some threats to this way of life? And I'll talk about 3 examples from the work that my group does to strengthen and support traditional food systems to ensure that traditional way of life continues across generations. So to orient everybody, we all know that Alaska's big. It's about 1/5 the size of the US. The YK Delta in southwestern Alaska is also very large. A visiting health professional to the region once said, imagine you were tasked with providing health care to the state of Washington, and then you took away all the roads. And that's what it's like in the Delta. The 50+ communities are all located off the road system, and that has tremendous implications for the food supply system and for access to food. So the YK Delta has a dual food system. On one side, we have the traditional food system that includes foods from the land, the water, and the sky. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide here because I'm going to be talking more about traditional foods later, but I do want to highlight that these are all very nutrient-dense foods. On the other side, we have foods from the store. So these are foods that are brought into the communities. As I mentioned, there's some major challenges to the food supply chain in rural Alaska. The cheapest way to get foods to communities is on the barge, which only runs a few times during the summer. And so most food is shipped on bush planes, leading to pretty high prices. So you can see here, let's see if I can get this, the cost of soda can often be cheaper than the cost of water. And so as a result of some of these challenges, foods in the store tend to be highly shelf stable, highly processed, and expensive. So when we think about a traditional way of life, people, especially like me, who are nutrition scientists, we think about consumption. What is on a person's plate? But a subsistence way of life is a lot more than that. It starts with, preparing to go out to harvest food. So maybe setting a net, or fixing a motor, or even mentally preparing to go out and hunt. A subsistence way of life also includes the harvest, so hunting, fishing, gathering. The care of the food, so cutting and hanging fish, storing greens for winter, or even making fish soup or a gudek. All of these constitute a subsistence way of life. So Rose Dominic, who is a collaborator who co-leads the Nekpiatput and Rugut group, she often talks about this traditional way of life using an iceberg as a metaphor. So the activities that I described, preparation, harvest, care, and consumption, they constitute the top of the iceberg. So it's what we see, it's what we can talk about, it's what we can measure. But what's below that is the worldview, the beliefs, and the values that are transmitted when these activities are practiced, when they're taught, and when they're learned. And so it's this whole iceberg that constitutes a traditional way of life. And so one of the challenges with nutrition is that most of the work that we do is up here. So it's easy to have activities that talk about consumption. It's easy to provide nutrition facts for traditional foods. What's harder for us to do is this deeper stuff. And that's what's really going to be important to include in nutrition programming if we want it to be self-sustaining. And so one of the challenges that the field of nutrition faces in integrating traditional knowledge and traditional worldviews into nutrition programs is that we haven't had a good way to talk about it. And so this group, the Nekpiatput and Rugut group, we've been developing a conceptual framework that illustrates how a subsistence way of life contributes to holistic health. And so this has been a 2 to 3 year long process. We worked with a group of elders. This says Kazyak circles. And so Kazyak circles there isn't a really good translation in English. What it means is talking and learning circles that are centered around traditional knowledge and values. And in this case, the elders were talking to us about a traditional way of life and how it contributes to holistic health. And so what we did is all of these discussions were recorded. We transcribed them, we translated them, and then what we did was we took what the elders said and we tried to identify themes. And based on those themes, we started forming a model. And you can see some of the initial stages of this conceptual model that we created. And all along the way, we took our work back to the elders to ensure that what we were saying reflected what they had intended. And before I show you the model, I want to talk about the challenge that we faced. Is we were taking something very holistic, which is elders' wisdom and knowledge, and trying to compartmentalize it and break it down into something that researchers, public health professionals, and non-natives would understand and use. So this is a draft of the inside of our conceptual model. So it talks about how subsistence contributes to holistic health, illustrated here by the 4 quadrants. So we have physical health, mental health, spiritual health, and emotional health. And I'm going to go through each of these one by one to explain them in a little bit more depth. So elders shared that subsistence contributes to emotional health by promoting a sense of connection and self-esteem through the act of sharing and gratitude that happens when you give food and you receive food. And so this elder said, when I look at the fish, I want to give the best part. That's what I do when I see the fish. I'm always filled with gratitude because I'm given some things to share. Subsistence contributes to spiritual health by promoting a sense of purpose and identity and understanding of a person's place in the world. So how do they connect to the community, to the environment, to animals? Subsistence contributes to mental health by promoting focus, discipline, intentionality. It keeps the mind busy. And so one elder said, even though our backs hurt, we continue to gather nonstop while it's here, strengthening our will. Not only strengthen our will, but conditions our mind to learn what will be useful to us. And then finally, subsistence contributes to physical health by requiring physical activity. It's a very active endeavor, and through the food's nutritional benefits and medicinal applications. And so the next set of slides is I'm going to share some data on how the field of nutritional anthropology has contributed to what we know about the relationship between traditional foods and physical health. So the data I'm going to show you is all based on some early studies from the Center for the Alaska Native Health Research. We found that traditional foods are nutrient dense and contribute to diet quality. So we compared people in 6 communities who consume high levels of traditional foods with people who consume low levels, and found that those who consume high levels of traditional foods had significantly more essential fatty acids, iron, vitamin A, vitamin E, and vitamin D in their diets. And these are all nutrients that tend to be low in the diets of most people in the US. Two students, Amanda Walsh and Courtney Hill, also did some work looking at the relationship between traditional foods and diet quality. And Amanda's study that was conducted in urban Alaska with the urban Alaska Native people found that for every 10% increase in calories from traditional foods, which is equivalent to about 195 calories, that equated to a 7.3% increase in diet quality. This study actually was conducted by Dr. Brett Lewick, who's here in the audience. And in this study, we compared, again, people who consumed low levels of traditional food, illustrated by the yellow bars, and people with high levels of traditional foods, illustrated by the bars filled with fish, in terms of vitamin D status. And so the reason that I chose fish was because there are very few food sources of vitamin D, and really the only one that we consume in great amounts is fish. Yeah, go ahead. Do you have a question?
Yeah, how do you, like diet quality, how do you describe that? What's your metric for it?
That's a really good question. So diet quality, there are a lot of different ways that you can measure diet quality. The way that we did it is we measured it looking at adherence to the dietary guidelines for Americans, which is a little bit flawed. So the way that they do it is that they look at food groups. So are you eating enough fruits and vegetables? Are you eating enough protein? Are you eating enough essential fats? Are your sugar levels low? And so that's really the only way we can get at an overall diet quality score. But that's a really good question. So in here we were looking at the relationship between vitamin D levels and traditional food intake. And vitamin D in Alaska, as you know, is a nutrient of interest because most of us get our vitamin D from the sun, except on days like this, we don't have a lot of sun. And so on the x-axis, what we have are vitamin D levels, deficient, insufficient, and adequate, and the percent of the population. And I'm just going to focus on these two bars. So these are people who are getting adequate or who have adequate levels of blood vitamin D. And so what you can see is that almost 90% of people who consume high levels of traditional foods are in this adequate category, compared to about 50% who are not consuming a lot of traditional foods. And I will say that in this population, even people who are in the low category, they're still eating a lot more fish than most of us. And then finally, this slide is looking at the relationship between BMI and triglycerides. So BMI is just a proxy for carrying excess weight, and we know that excess weight is associated with is a risk factor for certain diseases. So BMI tends to be related to triglyceride levels, which is a risk factor for heart disease. And so what we have here are two categories. So I'll mention that measuring diet is really difficult to do because the way that we do it is by asking people, what did you eat? And it's really hard for people to remember what they ate, and it's even harder for them to quantify the portion size. So it's very challenging. So we try to rely on biomarkers when we can. So in this case, we looked at the fat concentration of the red blood cells. So the red blood cells, your red blood cells are surrounded by lipids that are drawn from the foods that you eat. So we looked at red blood cell omega-3 fats, and we know that that's coming predominantly from fish. And so we compared people who were consuming low levels and high levels, or who had low levels of omega-3 fats in their red blood cells, which is the same as saying they consume high levels or low levels of traditional foods. And so if you look at this red bar, so these are people with low levels of omega-3 fats, you can see that that relationship is true. So people who have, as their BMI goes up, their triglycerides go up, increasing the risk of heart disease. But if you look at people who have high levels of omega-3 fats in the red blood cells, that relationship disappears. So the relationship between BMI and triglycerides is attenuated by intake of traditional foods. So that's another benefit. So those are 3 data slides from the field of nutritional epidemiology. I do want to mention that nutrition, the field of nutrition, has a history of being very reductionistic in their thinking. And so people since antiquity have been interested in the relationship between food and health. I think it was Hippocrates, but don't quote me on that, who figured out that if you give someone liver, it'll prevent night blindness. And so we've been interested for a really long time trying to figure out what is it about the liver, what is in the liver that's preventing that. And so the field of nutrition science is very young. So it was less than 100 years ago that we identified and isolated the first vitamin, thiamine. And so the history of the modern field of nutrition science was based on identifying deficiencies. And this is really important. So if you have anemia, you want to give someone iron. If you have scurvy, you want to give someone vitamin C. But now that deficiency diseases are not particularly common in the US at least, we have chronic diseases, diet-related diseases, these reductionistic approaches don't really work. And they also don't work in Alaska Native communities when the view of health is much more holistic. And so the final data slide I want to show you is just we found that people who had higher levels of enculturation, which means the extent to which they're living out traditional norms and values, so how much are they participating in a traditional way of life, that was associated with higher levels of physical activity, lower levels of stress, which in turn was related to lower percent body fat, lower waist circumference, and lower blood pressure. So this is the complete model. The outside of the model shows the indigenous way of teaching or passing on traditional knowledge. And so here is an image of Rose teaching her daughter how to cut fish. And this is taught with love and gratitude and humor, with the natural laws, empathy, compassion, sympathy, and patience. And this way of teaching is collectively called karoyun, which translates into cultural care. And elders say that if something is taught with karoyun, it entices the learner to want to learn. It opens their mind, so they're ready to learn and adopt these behaviors and these values. And then the outside of the circle is just in practice, how are these things taught? They're taught through role modeling, observation, practice and repetition, through listening, teaching about sharing, and storytelling. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some threats to a traditional subsistence way of life. So the easiest way to visualize shifting, a shift in this is by looking at what people eat. And this is a very top of the iceberg activity, right? Measuring what people eat. And so what goes along with this, and I want you to just keep this in the back of your head, is a loss of transmission of traditional knowledge, values, and worldviews. And so a nutrition transition, is indeed or has been occurring in Alaska Native communities since colonization happened. And this is characterized by a shift from consumption of a nutrient-dense traditional diet to a diet that's highly processed, energy-dense. And this transition is particularly pronounced in youth. So we have age groups here, 14 to 19-year-olds, 20 to 39, 40 to 59, and 60-plus-year-olds, and percent calories from traditional foods. And you can see that there's a linear relationship. So with youth, less than 10% of their calories are coming from traditional foods, compared to 60-year-olds or older, where upwards of 40 to 50% of their calories are coming from traditional foods. So when elders are concerned, one elder said that he's concerned that kids these days are using their store as their food shed. And so there's concern that as these kids age, they're not going to have the resilience and the healthy lifestyles to help support wellness. So some of the drivers of this transition are colonization and historical trauma, which disrupted subsistence patterns and the transmission of traditional knowledge. And that's at the root of a lot of interconnected health disparities, including disparities in diet-related diseases. One elder said, "I think the changes with the federal government coming and starting to feed us processed foods and others really changed our life. And then the food stamps came, and then people started buying processed foods or getting the processed foods. And then in a very short period of time, it went from very healthy people into, getting dependent on somebody else's rules of nutrition. So this is a really clear example of the impact of colonization. And so even though colonization, the way it manifests, has changed over time, it hasn't abated, it continues. And then the elder ends by saying, when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came over and started the USDA, and we just started to eat food in the schools, and it was different from our diet at home, it really changed. And then finally, climate change. So there's a lot of evidence to show how climate change is impacting access to traditional foods. 2 examples of that is thinning ice and unpredictable weather is making it harder for people to access their traditional hunting grounds. In addition to that, unpredictable or change in animals' migration patterns makes it really unpredictable to find the animals and to harvest them. I also want to talk a little bit about a project that we did in collaboration with Head Starts in 12 communities in the YK Delta to understand what are some of their perspectives, the perspectives of the parents on threats to eating in a good way. And so we recruited parents to use this app. It's called the Our Voice Discovery Tool. And this was an app developed by Stanford University to encourage community members to document aspects in their community that either facilitate or make it harder to live healthy lifestyles. And so we asked parents to take photos in response to these prompts. What about your life supports your family eating in a good way? And what about your life makes it challenging for your family to eat in a good way? And so I'm going to show you a few slides from the study. So the first one, this person took this photo and said, "This is my kid and my sister's son, fresh smoked chums, boiled half-dried chums, pilot crackers, hot vegetables. This is a good lunch or dinner. We try to have it as much as we can. There's a really big challenge because we haven't had enough chums or kings since 2019. It's hard to get them due to low numbers." And so you can see that they would like to feed their families in this way, but there are some challenges. And so once the parents took these pictures, what we did was we again organized them into themes according to what's called the social ecological model. So this model or framework views individuals as being embedded in these broader environments. So individuals are embedded in households, in communities, in the natural environment, and then there are policies that influence all of this. And so this framework is used to see how individual and environmental level factors influence behaviors. And so again, we organized what parents said around some threats into these themes. And so at the policy level, parents said that hunting and fishing restrictions are impacting their ability to participate in subsistence. Climate change is having an impact. The high cost of gas makes it hard to go out and subsist. Lack of material resources for subsistence. Some parents talked about not having a smokehouse. Convenience of market food. So there's a big tension between a market economy and a subsistence economy. Lack of time, lack of traditional knowledge. Their kids prefer market foods, which is a challenge. How many of you have kids who, when you take to the grocery stores, they want sugar-sweetened cereals and things like that? And then finally, stress and burnout. So I'm going to talk about 3 efforts that my group has done to try to strengthen and support traditional food systems. 2 of them are things that we did in the past, and 1 is an effort that we're just starting. So the first one is a Fish to School program that's called Nekailicha Vigman, and this was a pilot study that we conducted in 2 communities along the Yukon. And so the goal of this project was to reconnect students to their traditional food system in response to that figure that I showed you earlier, that kids are only eating less than 10% of their calories from traditional foods. And we wanted to make sure that this program was aligned with traditional values. And so to do that, we collaborated with this 10-member community advisory board to develop this intervention in 2 phases. And in nutrition, we talk about programs as interventions, but it's really just a nutrition program. And so in phase 1, we worked with these community members to understand local perceptions on the connection between salmon and well-being. And we chose salmon because it's a culturally important food and it's commercially available, so it could be sold or it could be served in the school lunches. And then in phase 2, we incorporated these local perceptions into the intervention design. So this program had 3 components. In the first component, we served locally caught salmon in the school lunches, and we purchased the salmon from a local fish processor that at that time, families worked for the fish processor in the summer, as did students. The second component was in the classroom. We developed a series of lessons or a curriculum that talked about how what kids choose to eat influences not only their nutrition, their personal health, but how does it correspond with community values, and how does it impact the environment. And so these lessons on the left, they were stories about 3 food supply chains. So the food supply chain of a fish stick, a commercial salmon, and a subsistence salmon. And so the students read these stories about these food supply chains, and they were asked to consider the impacts, both positive and negative, along this food supply chain. So the example of the fish stick, pollock is typically used in fish sticks. It's caught in Alaskan waters, but we don't have a processing facility. So that pollock is shipped to Massachusetts, where it's breaded and fried and put into boxes, and then shipped back to Anchorage, and then maybe put on a plane to get sent out to communities where it's served in the school lunch. And so students thought about, okay, what is the impact of that on our nutrition? What is the impact on our culture? What is the impact of the environment of having this fish flown all over the world just to end up back where it was caught? We also developed this game based loosely on the game of life, where students traveled downriver and they encountered situations and made decisions. And by the end of the game, the hope was that they would have enough fish to last them through the winter, enough money, and enough that they had shared enough goodwill with their community. So it was looking at how goodwill, fish, and money is exchanged in the community. And I'll say we're trying to update this game, so if there are any game players who would like to collaborate on this, I welcome that. And then finally, we had community events that were designed to connect the community with the program. And these community events were designed to be intergenerational. So I'm noticing that I'm using an older version of this PowerPoint presentation, and so we're missing some of the photos that I was hoping to share, so I'll describe them. One of these community events was a scavenger hunt, a fish-themed scavenger hunt. So picture kids who, as part of the scavenger hunt, had to make salmon costumes and then take photos of themselves. They had to write poems around salmon, so it was a very interactive scavenger hunt. We also held an Iron Chef contest, which is sort of the culminating community event. And we invited Dr. Gary Ferguson, who is now at Washington State University, to MC this Iron Chef contest. And we also partnered with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium that runs the Store Outside Your Door program to film it. So I'm going to show you a clip. So this is just a 5-minute video of the Iron Chef contest. All right. So I'll say that in, sorry, I am good. many community events it's very difficult to get attendance. And so what you saw there was just an incredible amount of support from the community. People really like this program. And so as I mentioned, this was a pilot study, so our results were preliminary. What we found is that, so what we did was we compared students who received the program in one community to students who did not receive the program, who received it a year later. And students in the program were more likely to consume fish. They had significantly better diet quality measured in the same way, adherence to the dietary guidelines for Americans. And in all students, improvements were seen in perceptions of the benefits of salmon, outcome expectancies around eating Yupik food. And so that means, what did they think would happen if they ate more Yupik food? Would they be healthier? Would they be stronger? Would they be more connected to their culture? Attitudes towards the impact of food choice on the environment, and attitudes towards the importance of having skills to harvest, process, and prepare salmon. So the next effort that I want to talk about is a collaboration between Family Nutrition Program. They're housed at the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services, and their mission is to support Alaskan families in making nutrition decisions through science-based nutrition education and the delivery of supplemental foods through family nutrition programs. So they oversee WIC and SNAP. Both programs provide education. And so they contracted with the Center for Alaska Native Health Research with my group to conduct formative research to understand perceptions of vegetable fruit in the YK Delta. Leadership in this group for a long time has been very committed to making sure that their education materials reach all Alaskans and are culturally appropriate. So they asked that we do some research in the YK Delta, and based on this research, to develop culturally centered nutrition education materials. And so the reason that they chose fruits and vegetables is that we know that most people in the US don't consume enough fruits and vegetables. So this is looking at the percent of people who meet recommendations, and you can see that among both non-Native Alaskans and people in the YK Delta, we're not doing a very good job meeting recommendations for fruit and vegetables. As I said, measuring what people eat is difficult, so this is based on self-report. We also used what's called a veggie meter. So I brought the veggie meter in case anyone wants to try it after this. So the veggie meter is an objective way of measuring fruit and vegetables. It's based on resonance spectroscopy, and it measures skin carotenoid levels. And so carotenoids are those pigments in fruits and vegetables that make them brightly colored and also have antioxidant properties. And so there isn't a direct relationship between a specific level or veggie meter score and serving of fruits and vegetables. We just know that higher is better. And so Courtney Hill was a student, UAF alum, who is now getting her PhD at University of Washington in epidemiology. She conducted 2 studies. One was with 3 to 5-year-olds in the YK Delta, and their veggie meter score was 195. She also conducted a study with adults in the YK Delta, and women had a significantly lower veggie meter score than men, but both lower than UAF students. I was not part of these studies. I'm just putting up there for comparison. So New Zealanders have a veggie meter score of 342, Japanese adults of 343, and North Carolina low-income women of 239. I'll mention that the highest score I've ever seen was at last year's Current Festival, that I'll mention a little bit later, was I think over 650. So you're welcome to try it and see how you compare afterwards. So the research that we did is we conducted what are called card sorts. We created a series of 70 cards that had pictures of fruits and vegetables from the store and from the tundra, and we asked participants to sort them in a few different ways. So the first was an open sort. We said, just put these into categories that make sense to you and label those categories. And so this is one sort. So this person labeled them as wild, berries, fruits, and veggies. And so this was the most common way to sort this. And this is important because what do you hear when you see the USDA MyPlate messages? Eat more fruits and vegetables. So if people aren't putting berries and wild plants into that category, that message isn't going to resonate. We also ask people to sort them into the frequency that they consume them, and I'll just highlight that the never category, that was often filled with tundra plants. That's not something that people consume a lot of. And so we developed messages for these nutrition education materials based on these findings. So we found that we also conducted in-depth interviews with the women around the card sorts. We found that interest in consuming more plants from the tundra is high, but knowledge about tundra plants was limited. So in the materials that we developed, and that I'll show you in a minute, we wanted to make sure to provide information on how to identify, harvest, and prepare these plants. We found that plants from the tundra aren't viewed as vegetables and fruit, so we wanted to highlight that plants from the tundra count as vegetables and fruit. Passing on traditional knowledge about plants was valued, so we wanted to highlight the importance of transferring traditional knowledge to children, and that the materials we developed was accessible to children. Vegetables and fruit can be really expensive. The first time I went to a community, I'm originally from California, and I was shocked to buy a cabbage for $19. And so we wanted to highlight that plants from the tundra are virtually free. So a lot of subsistence can be expensive, but certain plants like sourdough, you go outside in the Delta and it's everywhere. And then finally, selection of grocery store produce is limited and the quality of fresh produce is poor. And so we wanted to make sure to include tips on how to store and preserve tundra plants so that they're available throughout the winter. And so these are some of the materials that we developed. We developed a series on YouTube called Tundra to Table. So we hired a UAF alum who was from a community out in the YK Delta to do cooking demonstrations that used wick foods and plants from the tundra. So an example is she made a sourdough smoothie with peanut butter and yogurt, and those are both wick foods. She made fireweed fried rice, and then also sourdough agurk. We created these series of mini magazines that I have examples of here, and the mini magazines have some of these messages. So it has some nutrition information, how to identify it, how to harvest it, some recipes, and then there was always an activity on the back for kids to engage kids. And then finally, we developed a series of text messages to encourage harvesting of tundra plants, and this is one example. Tired of waiting for the store to restock vegetables? Try adding sauteed fireweed shoots to your dinner. They're organic, full of vitamin C, plus they taste great too. And then this I just want to highlight as a policy that's in Alaska that really supports subsistence lifestyles. So with SNAP benefits, SNAP was formerly known as food stamps, so this is a supplemental nutrition assistance program. You can use SNAP benefits to purchase hunting and fishing gear. So that's something that's really, really fantastic. The last thing I want to talk about is a project that the Nikpiat in Ruget is starting up. So elders recognized, or they've recognized for a long time, that behavioral health programs that are developed using a Western model don't work for Yupik people. So they developed this program called Jali Jarik, and this is a system of care for behavioral health that's focused on living a balanced life through adherence to ancestral principles. So this program has been integrated into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation care. It's one of the most requested services at YKHC. And what it does is that it helps people understand the impact of colonization. So once they're aware of it, they can heal from it. And the main point is that it helps restore and strengthen traditions, values, and cultural teachings. And so what we want to do is we want to augment this program with concepts from Nikpiat and Ruget and find out, can this program be used to address food sovereignty, nutrition security, and diet-related diseases, given that these have similar roots in colonization. And so the goal is to develop this program that instead of emphasizing physical health, emphasizes holistic health, instead of being risk-based, is strength-based, and instead of focusing on healthy lifestyles, instead of having the message, exercise more, eat more fruits and vegetables, the focus is on promoting cultural identity, which we know is the most important protective factor. and then instead of being based on Western methodologies, to really integrate the Alaska Native worldview. So I'm going to end there, but actually what I'm going to end on is just I want to invite everyone to the Far North Current Festival. I'm a I guess, organizer of this. So this event's being held on August 24th. It's fun, and the reason that we are celebrating currents and we decided to have this festival is because we know that people aren't eating enough fruits and vegetables. These are very easy to grow. We're hoping that they'll become a commercial market for them, and they're delicious. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and you're also welcome to try the Vegemeter if you're interested.